to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. I'm al-Sirgany, here today as usual with Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi.
And Matthew Schmidt.
Hello.
Today we'll be discussing The Green Zone Rabbit by Hassan Blasim and translated by Johnathan Wright in the 2013 Comma Press edition of Blasim's The Iraqi Christ. The story is in the first person and tells the tale of Hajar, the narrator, and Salsa, as well as Hajar's rabbit. The events of the story's real time take place during the second U.S. occupation of Iraq, the Second Gulf War, Operation Iraqi Freedom, however you prefer to think about it, and importantly, after a new post-Saddam Hussein government has been formed. Hajar and Salsa are terrorists, and this is Hajar's first mission, an attempt to exact revenge for the violent murder of two of his brothers. While the two men await instructions in a mansion in the Green Zone, a heavily fortified area in the center of Baghdad that is home to diplomats and military types, among others, Hajar discovers that his rabbit has laid an egg, an event that throws the two men's world into confusion and anxiety. Because the story unfolds in reminiscences and toward a specific attack, I'll leave my summary here. But before we get into sort of questions and further explanation, is there anything I've missed that's critical for the understanding of the audience?
I don't think that there's anything that we wouldn't cover in conversation.
Cool.
Good job.
Right on. One hopes. So let's start with the troubled facts of the story. An egg-laying rabbit seems like a magical realist or a sort of folkloric element in this tale. It isn't, and that's going to drive how the narrator, or the narrative, is laid out. How the narrator lays the narrative out. So why present the egg in this story the way Hajar and or Blasim have? Why give us the intuition or the sense that the egg itself might actually have been laid?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, first of all, to just think about how you said that. Like, how the narrative is laid out, how the egg is laid. Right? Like, you know, as reminiscences, this is not chronological.
No.
And so the parts, like, kind of, there's no paragraph breaks. I mean, there are paragraph breaks, there's no, like, white space between paragraphs, is what I mean to say. And so everything hooks on to the last thing that happens, and it kind of weaves in and out without major pauses. That said, the egg is really funny at first because you're like, all right, rabbits don't lay eggs. And this egg is described as smaller than a chicken's egg.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting because I think the thing that really fascinates me at first is like wondering whether in fact it is an egg.
Yeah.
Because while it's described as an egg, with the word egg, we don't actually like get a good description of the egg qua egg.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, I don't really know exactly how to picture this, which is interesting. But we're assuming it's a little, you know, ovular object or something like that, you know, and smaller than chickens. That's all I know. I don't even know what color the egg is. It's just an egg. And I think, in one respect, I'm sitting there going, all right, this is pointing me towards something. Very particularly, but I don't know what that is because the egg enters in the first line of the story.
Yeah.
So there's confusion reigning at the beginning. And, you know, the egg appears inside their compound, which has security and cameras and all of these things. And when they go to look to see like how the egg got there, they can't find anyone on video. There's no reason to think that someone put it there. Right. Other than that, the rabbit didn't lay it. And so it almost is like, well, the rabbit definitely laid it. So it's kind of like, I kept thinking like, it's a red herring in a certain respect because of how it appears. And, you know, it ends up both being a red herring and not. Yeah. And I think that's what really it complicates the appearance of this egg. Yeah. And so what I think I'm going to keep coming back to in this conversation is that everything that's laid out in the story, while being fairly straightforward and clear, actually isn't. And that's the thing about the story that makes this story very fascinating.
Dude.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well put, and I'd come to something similar in terms of thinking about the egg as symbol, but also how, the actions within this, what the actions within the story represent, why tell this story in the first place, and I mean just the kind of objects and animals and situations that enter in. I think I want to touch on something you said, go back to it. The story begins with the egg. The first line is, "Before the egg appeared, I would read a book about law or religion every night before going to sleep." So, I mean, I think you're right that the story is immediately telling you that the egg has changed something. You don't know at that point that the egg has been laid by a rabbit, but the egg is throughout the narrative used as a way to sort of track time. I found the egg 3 days before is another line that comes up. So, I mean, you're told that the egg is important, and I mean, I immediately start wondering why, like, what is this egg, and why should I care about it? And, I mean, I think, like you, I also noticed that the egg cued me to what I did have a good visual on and what I didn't. You're right, it pops that we get the size of the egg, but we don't get another description of it. I imagine it as kind of like a smaller bird's egg. So it's interesting to hear you say that you're imagining it as potentially not an egg. I think the story is really careful that way in terms of what it's giving and what it's holding back in terms of its research, because the narrator is an avid reader and someone who knows about the behavior of rabbits, among other things. I think also because I was trying to think a little bit in terms of iconography and symbols. I was thinking a little bit about, okay, so we have a rabbit and we have an egg. Like, with my Christian background, I immediately think of Easter and of renewal. And I mean, even the title, the Green Zone Rabbit, the green in the title, like, I don't immediately, I mean, I do think of the green zone that I know, but the title makes me think of green as potentially lush as well, and potentially that kind of a springtime image. And I think there is conscious play with that, and for the first time in my life, I ended up looking into where the Easter rabbit actually comes from. And, the story is fascinating, and one thing that's very funny to me is I also, in an attempt to engage the story's particular play, I was thinking of, phrases like when pigs fly, in terms of when rabbits lay eggs. So I looked up rabbits and egg laying, and there is a lot of confusion about whether rabbits lay eggs. Apparently, people are looking into this on the internet a lot.
Wow.
In terms of the Easter Bunny and its origin, one thing I just did want to share about that too is that the Easter Bunny initially functioned a little bit like a Santa Claus type figure, where the bunny was delivering eggs, but to children specifically who had been good. And let's see, there was something else I wanted to mention. Yeah, so there's like judgment and like naughty, nice aspect of it. And then also, it was specifically German tradition, and that the colors sometimes held symbol as well. So, interesting that we don't get a specific color of this egg.
I mean, I think also the egg brings into question purity.
Yeah.
Sure.
Like the purity of the fact that
birth, renewal,
yeah,
fertility.
The fact that animals can lay these eggs that are smooth is an insane feat. And
yeah, it is, isn't it?
It really is. And there's also the note that Salsa eats an egg every morning, right? He fries up an egg every morning for his breakfast. And so we've got Salsa on one hand, and then we've got Hajar, who is taking care of this rabbit, and Salsa's kind of not that interested in the rabbit. He's maybe a little bemused, but also could care less about the rabbit, specifically because the rabbit came from Dala, and she's a lady who comes and cooks for them and brings cigarettes and cleans a little bit probably, and she's the one that found the rabbit in a park somewhere nearby. Can't find the owner, and so Hajar's taking care of the rabbit during this time. And so all of these reasons kind of factor into the fact that Salsa doesn't care for the rabbit because he once touched Umdala's behind, and she hit him on the nose with a spoon and made it bleed, and he has kept his distance and quietness from her since that time.
What a creep. So,
well, that gets a little off track there. I think to go back to the egg, it seems like the egg has, the book gives us a fully formed object that had to go through a gestation period for some animal.
Yeah.
And it just appears fully formed without the actual animal birthing the egg or laying the egg present. And then on the other hand, right, there's no evidence that anyone broke in and put the egg there. And so I think that's important to my understanding of the story later.
Yeah, I would agree. Even though it is, you mentioned magical realism, Adam, such a sort of perfect magical realist move that could have gone in that direction. I think it's treated in such a way that, my mind immediately reading this goes to, okay, who put this there?
Yeah.
I don't think that the rabbit has actually laid the egg, although that possibility lingers on First Street. I wonder about it, but it's not my first interpretation of where the story will go, crucially. One more strange Easter Bunny fact. You thought you were going to get away from this. Apparently, eggs are chosen as well because they were forbidden during Lent. And so they'd be a treat prior to fast and afterward. And there was sometimes kind of begging for eggs, like children now, go trick-or-treating for candy. I thought that was interesting, and my mind's still kind of turning around that and rebirth and the way this story seems simpler than it is, and also, I think, is deceptive in that simplicity, not in that it's much foldier than it is, but that in what you might expect to happen isn't necessarily what happens. And what the story is trying to point you to in terms of interpretation is often a little more complicated than the story lets on.
And if we follow your logic, the egg...
Can we?
Well, if the Easter Bunny gives eggs to the good children...
Right.
Like, Hajar is clearly the good child here.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if, while the egg is given to the rabbit, specifically, like, it is also specifically given to Hajar.
Yeah.
And not Salsa.
Yeah. Man, we got more mileage out of that egg question than I had anticipated. But I'm really fascinated sort of about the use of the egg as image, right? And I think, as Ingrid sort of astutely points out, the idea of the green zone and sort of fertility and the sort of original Edenic space, or the origins of some of that kind of idea that's now, right, like this idea of a semi-safe zone that's in danger in some ways, and all of those things that are going on as a result. So I appreciate you to unfolding that rather than trying to unfold it too much, because that's a lot to take in. I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of story structure and its approach and why we unwind, not only through the MacGuffin / not MacGuffin of the egg, but why we unwind in the way that we do. For me, the story feels a lot like an explanation in the way that it's told, partly because it's in the first person. Hajar's explaining what happened to him, and he does that by explaining sort of why he's doing what he's doing and why the people around him are doing what they're doing to his understanding, and what he doesn't know about any of that, which leaves some of the sort of verisimilitude of the what is the egg situation. I made a note that, like, to me, this story, it has an unfolding element that's a little like Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. I think for that reason, I'm going to focus a lot on individual characters, because we do sort of, in snippets of stories, Matthew mentioned, there aren't page breaks with the paragraphs, but we do get discrete narratives at times. So to begin, I'd love it if we could discuss what we know about Hajar, the narrator himself, and why he's involved in this operation. I briefly mentioned that he'd had some family members killed, but I think it's a little more complicated than all of that.
Yes, his family members were murdered in a particularly brutal way. He describes their bodies being drilled and then beheaded. I do understand that as the main reason why he's involved in this mission. Although, I think as a narrator, I find him to be a really interesting character. He's presented very early on in his own words, as a reader, one of his childhood friends points him to a trunk on the roof where they play, and within that trunk there are both dirty magazines with Turkish women in them, and there are also books about plants and animals, and the narrator treats this trunk like a library, and puts this interestingly, he no longer needs his friend once he finds the trunk. And he takes a dirty magazine and a book at a time and really becomes especially fascinated with plants and animals. That's something we learn about him. And, he's someone who, he describes in reading that he has a compulsion toward checking references as he reads, that he'll get on a subject and want to know more. And, I think spending time with other people who do this kind of thing compulsively, I think I imagined that one way on first read, and it was interesting to see what that looks like for this character. He describes getting really fascinated with kissing, and the way that he gets really fascinated with kissing is by understanding different behaviors of animals with kissing. So he describes chimpanzees who, when they feel threatened, kiss to kind of console, or I may be butchering this a little, I'm talking from memory, to console or kind of fend off that fear for their mates. And then he describes tropical fish who kiss for 3 hours at a time, or 3 hours, a half hour at a time without break. And he describes an insect that when you're sleeping finds its way, if you're sleeping in a healthy way, to the corner of your mouth and leaves drops of poison there. So you have a poison kiss then. And this was one of those moments where, as a reader, some of what I was thinking was like, okay, this is all fascinating and doing so much work in terms of characterization, but like, why am I finding out this in particular about this narrator? And what does this have to do with the story at hand? And I sat with that for a while. I'm not sure that I have the best answer. I think I've been thinking along these lines partly since reading Saunders' book, Swinging Upon the Rain, which was really influential to me in terms of what you notice in the work it does, and why particular content matters. And I think, to me, some of this, what this does is shows us who this character was before, and also shows us the ways in which he's engaging plant and animal life as consoling, as consoling material, as escapism, as a replacement for friendships and engaging reality. I think the kinds of kisses that he becomes fascinated with, it's interesting that we get the list that we do, and I like it that it's not pointing directly to something in the story per se, but that, his mind is turning over these different things, and they don't fit together neatly exactly, but he's looking at a thing not from, one perspective, not from a romantic perspective, not from a, like, this is safe and saving me perspective, but from all these different angles. And in kind of, I think the word wanting to, like, reference, wanting to search out references made me think that he would be more of a, maybe like academically oriented thinker than he is. And I think he's actually trying to understand the place he's in through these texts. I think that's the kind of best gloss I have of the material, that like he's at one point he describes a sort of mythical animal as alienating, and I think the real animals and plants around him seem to be kind of moors for him.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm going to come back to that momentarily.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a small section here just so we get a little bit of the book.
Yeah.
The story here and why he is in this operation. So, quote, I ran away from military service. I couldn't endure the system of humiliation there. At night, I worked in a bakery. I had to support my mother and my 5 brothers. I lost the urge to read. For me, the world became like an incomprehensible mythical animal. A year after I ran away, the regime was overthrown, and I was free of my fear of punishment for my earlier desertion. The new government abolished conscription. When the cycle of violence and the sectarian decapitations began, I planned to escape the country and go to Europe, but then they massacred 2 of my remaining brothers. Right, so we see that he has actually already run away from the army before, it was safe to do so.
Yeah.
And is kind of secretly working in a bakery and supporting his family. And, I don't know that we ever get whether he's like the eldest son or not in the story. However, either he's the eldest son or he feels a very particular need to support his family, right?
Yeah.
And he even has realized that he probably shouldn't be in Iraq anyway, that he's not meant to live there, at least mentally, because it's too much for him. He can't deal with all of these things that are happening. And I think that speaks a lot to what Ingrid was saying about the kissing, in that he reads to try to understand the world.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there is not a book that says, like, this is how you understand the world. There's no such thing that encompasses all the different facets of the world.
Yeah.
And so he focuses in on certain things at different times and, like, tries to follow those, like, to their end point so that he has, like, a fairly solid understanding of one, like, subsection of something. And I think his problem is that, he has a really hard time with the violence, where the violence stems from, the fact that military service when he's of age requires him to join, the fact that law and religion are considered both separate and together, right? There's religious law, then there's law, and then there's religion. And, like, there is overlap there, and yet, like, as subjects, they're kept apart in a certain manner.
Yeah.
And so I think he's really confused about the things that say, like, this is the idea, and we do not listen to anything outside of the idea.
Yeah.
That's the thing that really bothers him. And so that he ends up joining one of his uncle's sects in order to become, for lack of a better word, a terrorist.
Yeah.
And operate outside of the regular laws and in some cases religion.
Yeah.
And so the final straw for him being the massacre of 2 of his brothers, right? So the family unit that he's spent so much time protecting and providing money and food for, all of a sudden 2 of those members have been slayed, and he has to leave home because he can't look at his family members because he feels like somehow it's his fault that his brothers were slayed because they were at work and they were coming home from work when they were taken. And, you know, I think maybe in his mind he was thinking, like, I can take this family on my back and, like, take care of everything. That's not really in the story. I think that's a possible reading. But the other possible, you know, there's several possible readings. But another reason is just the fact that, like, he's had enough of all of this uncertainty and killing for no reason. And because of that, he kind of, like, throws in everything to become a terrorist. And at the same time, once he becomes a terrorist, he goes back to reading law and religion books. Yeah. And I think one of the most telling things in the section that describes the villa a little bit is that there's a massive bookshelf with all of these law and religion books on it. And the law and religion books are separated by animal statues, basically. Yeah. And, you know, it's just like, even a representation of an animal is separating these different ideas. And he is, I think, fascinated by this, in that, like, the one thing about animals is, generally speaking, most animals don't harm humans, and while they harm each other in the food chain, like, they're not destroying for no reason. Yeah. And that's the thing that really, like, I think connects him to animals and so forth.
Yeah, I think there's a pleasure-killing, power-killing element about torture that involves drilling into someone's body, or decapitation as symbology, which I think is really interesting about this story in general, right? Like, I think it handles, like, the traumatic in this incredibly articulate way, and that I think it's truer to the experience of highly traumatic scenarios where the need to over-explain and over-analyze is somewhat dampened by just the perpetual need to survive in adaptive circumstances, or circumstances that continually feel unsafe for Hajar. And I think that's, I mean, what a difficult space to be operating in, right? Like, not only because I think there's, you know, this sort of Western idea of religion and politics, or religion and law being separate. It's very different from Sharia or fiqh as sort of structures of law, but also, right, like, that aren't that wildly different, right? Like, I think we don't, at this point in America, recognize how many of our laws originate in some kind of religious mentality or our designs. And I think Hajar's such an interesting person in that he does, right? Like, for him, kissing, when he's thinking about it, when he's making that list, is, as Ingrid, you noted, it's lip-to-lip contact, right? Without maybe questions about motivation, right? It's action above need, although he does state the reason that those various animals create that lip-to-lip contact while keeping the sort of definition of kissing as that. Matthew, you also, I think, got into sort of a set of questions I have here, so I'm going to kind of ask two of them at once and let you to continue to parse this out a bit. And that's that all of this, there's Hajar and who he is, and then there's Hajar's animal metaphors. I mean, he's very much permeated by them. There's the rabbit itself, and I'm hoping that we'll talk a little bit more about the rabbit. Matthew, you alluded a little bit to why the rabbit is hanging out in a safe house. But there's also, you know, Hajar himself, who's called Duckling because this is his first mission. The egg as an animal sort of gestative space and Easter and other imagery, as Ingrid notes. And there's the kissing, and there are the animal, like, sculptures, all of this. Why in a war zone? When the focus of the actual events is life and death, right? These two guys are going to go kill somebody. That's their mission. Are we so preoccupied with, or why is Blasim, or why is Hajar, why are they so preoccupied with animals here? I'm also going to just sidebar note, my apologies for the genie in the icebox and a bit of rain if it's catching your ears, listeners.
Before we entirely move on, I think one thing I wanted to note that we moved by a little quickly, but that both of you touched on, I think smartly, is in terms of the narrator's motivation to start doing this work, the line we get, or the paragraph we get immediately after learning about what's happened to his two brothers is this: I was completely devastated and I left home. I couldn't bear to see the horror on the faces of my mother and brothers. I felt lost and no longer knew what I still wanted from this life. I took a room in a dirty hotel until my uncle came to visit me and suggested I work with his sect to exact revenge. I think a few things strike me about this, hearing what you guys had to say. The one line in this story that on first read I felt a little iffy about was I was completely devastated. I wanted to see a little more of the character's devastation on first read, or to stay with what that was for him a little more, and I think hearing you two talk about him surviving that situation, I feel differently about that line. And I mean, I started to sit here imagining how he could be relating to revenge in this work. And I think it's really important that we get I felt lost first. That he is putting the language of revenge in his uncle's mouth. And that he's a little at once like overblown and oversimple in his language around what's happened, and specifically unable to face how it affects others. I think you two were both saying that, but we said it quickly, and I think it's really crucial to the story.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Both that there's something that he's incapable of sort of emotionally engaging about losing his loved ones in the way that he's lost them, but also that, like, there's a certain indifference to his choice to be here, and what happens in this space is not going to, like, give him time to heal at all, you know?
Well, I mean, speaking to your animal question, like, that's what he's trying to do. Why animals? Because of life.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the obvious answer to me, or broad answer, in that animals, like the fact that there's a rabbit alive in this war zone in the first place, even if it's in, like, the green zone, is, impressive. And animals have kind of shown that they can continue to live and even thrive where civilization destroys land and people and everything. And so it's like the one positive thing that the world goes on, even in these times of crisis, uncertainty, violence, all of these things. I think that's one big reason these animals are in the story. I think another thing is that Hajar doesn't necessarily believe in violence.
Yeah.
And he is more related with these animals in that, if there's no reason for it, like, there's no reason for it. and he kind of temporarily, in my mind at least, falls into the trap of he's been pushed too far and wants to lash out because he has nowhere to put his feelings and nowhere to put his fears and nowhere to put his dead brothers.
Yeah.
And so he's trying to figure things out, but in the meantime his uncle comes with this easy way out. It's not easy, obviously, but it's a decision made for him, and he can go along with that for the time being. And eventually he comes out with this, and in the story, and one of the final things he tries to do in the story is save the rabbit. He takes the rabbit with him on their mission, unbeknownst to Salsa, because if they leave the rabbit at the villa, which they're not coming back to, the rabbit's going to die of starvation.
Rabbit thoughts and animal thoughts. I happened to be reading a book on an Italian Renaissance painter this morning before reading this story, and
As you do.
As I do, Veronese. I was reading about his 4 allegories, and some of what the art historian who wrote the book is talking about within the allegories is that their narrative isn't straightforward per se, and that there's a ton of mirroring and visual rhyming, but that to spend your time parsing when exactly it's mirroring and rhyming and what that adds up to would be to misunderstand the work as a whole. And I read that, came to this story, and was paying attention to animals and the ways in which within this story there are a ton of mirrors in terms of behavior and kind of rhyming behavior. Literally, there's a direct comparison that Hajar makes between himself and the rabbit, but then he's also the duckling in terms of his experience, and of course ducks can lay eggs. I think there are those things. I think, to Matthew's point, I read the relationship to animals to have much more to do with healing and with life and with a connection to a past self who's looking for renewal and, almost to go back to nature, not in a way that is making it ideal, but in a way that's just more about noticing and observation. One weird rabbit hole that I ended up going down, in terms of what this story is on the surface and what the other story that it's telling. If you look closely, is at one point Hajar notes that his rabbit is eating its own poop.
Yeah.
And, I think playing Hajar with myself a little bit, I wanted to know if that was common, if that was evidence of sickness in rabbits or what. Apparently it is common, and he is right that there are nutrients in that for rabbits. They only eat a specific kind of poop. For those who want to know more about this, I'm here for you. I won't go into all the details, but I think it's interesting because on first read you're tempted to think an animal, so stupid. It's doing this, and what Hajar quickly points out is that there are nutrients in this poop, and I think in a way Hajar is sort of Salsa's whipping boy in this story, and presumed to be less experienced. And I think one of the most telling mirrors for me is actually that moment, in that I think Hajar is much more clued into what's going on and what particular incidents mean than other characters.
Yeah, so you bring up Salsa. Let's talk about Salsa a little bit. He like you note, Ingrid, he's the more experienced terrorist. We're going to keep saying terrorist because there is some extra governmental killing going on. But I welcome anyone reading the story to interpret it differently. I want to sort of think out who Salsa is, his way of being, which, as Matthew noted earlier, involves sexually harassing a middle-aged woman, drinking, smoking, eating eggs every breakfast, which happens to be in the early afternoon. He's also pretending to be a Tolstoy fan on Facebook. So what's Salsa's deal, man? And why is he doing all that? And why doesn't his sort of cool and savviness, I don't know if that's the way to describe it, end up saving him in the end?
Salsa's cool and savviness?
Yeah, like I think he seems like he's not too, like, I think throughout the story preoccupied with, like, at least at the beginning of the story, he seems kind of indifferent and almost like lax, right? The first bits of information we get about him are that he wakes up at noon, he has an egg, he talks a lot of shit, he gets on Facebook.
I guess saving him, how do you mean saving him?
Well, he doesn't survive the story.
Yeah, so how's he saved?
I'm asking, why doesn't it save him?
Oh.
Like, why doesn't his experience save him from, getting blown up in a car?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, Matthew, partly because Salsa actually reminds me a great deal of someone I know. So, I think I was a...
Jesus! Come back to that.
Well, I mean, I think I was looking at him as someone in, a really intense space and thinking about what that is for him as well as Hajar. And there are different ways of coping with that time. And, I think you could look at him pretending to be a Tolstoy fan and, putting up this charcoal image of Tolstoy on Facebook as, being an imposter, being pretentious and falsely so, not having anything to back the pretension. But I think I actually see him, in a very similar way to Hajar, like with that activity reaching for something, like he becomes very fascinated with the deputy I'm gonna be dyslexic about this culture that
the deputy minister of culture.
He becomes fascinated with his character, and I think the word humane is used around his fascination with that man and intellectual, and I think he's seeking to kind of connect with his soul almost in this space and to distance himself from what's going on by through pretending, through engaging actual intellectuals and thinkers, and I think I see that with. I see the place he's in. I understand that. I think in terms of why this doesn't save him, I think that's a harder question for me to answer. For me, my read is that he becomes so interested in the Deputy Minister of Culture that he's breaking one of the rules of that space, which Hajar notes that it's not a good idea to be online too much in chat rooms. I think his fascination with that story, on first read it was interesting. I thought maybe he was aware of who the Deputy Minister of Culture was and was spying on him, but it turns out to be the reverse. is my read. Adam's making a
Yeah,
face.
no,
That's weird.
I think that there's a lot of I think there's a lot of uncertainty or things that Hajar himself doesn't know. We don't have. I think not having an omniscient narrator leaves in the end a lot of events unexplained or not explained in their entirety. So I think that that's a valid read. I think it's one that I hadn't had myself. So I
certainly like there could be another read could be that he is aware of the deputy minister of culture and needs to attach himself to that person and see that person as a person before he kills him.
Yeah, so the deputy minister of the culture is the target ultimately, but Hajar doesn't know that for certain.
Right, Hajar's definitely in the dark. It's unclear at what point Salsa finds out in the story. I read surprise when he sees the rabbit and the egg image. But I'll open this up to Matthew. I feel like I'm babbling now.
I mean, I think Salsa is the character I have the most trouble with.
In what regard?
What?
In what regard?
In that I don't feel like I can make an argument that I feel good about around him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I can say some things here, I don't know that I believe them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, on one hand, why in the hell does he have a computer in the house? Why is that even allowed?
Yeah.
Like, that's my first question. And yet he has one. And apparently there is also internet in the house.
Yeah.
And he's using it, and someone's paying for this. And I know they're posing as, bodyguards to be for someone in the green zone, but, you don't need a computer for that. And so, I guess the main read I kind of get on him is that he's meant to be a casualty in this situation for some sort of agreement that we don't know about. He is sacrificed to appease someone, probably for killing someone else previously.
Yeah.
And he even knows it because he gets in an argument with Mr. Salman, who is their handler, again, for lack of a better term.
Right.
Because of the egg that is in the compound, that shouldn't be in the compound, that shouldn't be a rabbit's egg, because they don't lay eggs. And so he is tipped off that something's wrong. And yet he goes through with the mission anyway. And, I can only suspect that he thinks somehow he will figure out a way out of this to be able to live, while also knowing the chances are not good, but that he has nowhere to run.
Yeah, I think that we're getting into the meat of the story here. And while we're tossing out interpretations of how this story ends, I'm going to ask you a couple questions around other characters, particularly the Deputy Minister of Culture, but let's be sure, for the sake of everyone listening, that we sort of lay out the baseline facts of the end of this story. So Hajar introduces us to several characters who we're going to see throughout the story, and they're going to take on sort of different roles or more active roles as the story comes toward its climax. We've already mentioned Umdala, who brings the rabbit. She's a maid who's affiliated with the group somehow. Mr. Salman, who Matthew just mentioned, is the handler of this mission. Ingrid earlier mentioned Salam, who is the childhood friend. I think there's different flatnesses to those characters. With they all have kind of functional behavior within the story, and then there's the Deputy Minister of Culture, who we've been talking a little bit about, target of the intended killing, or at least that's what we're given to understand on the day that the mission goes ahead. And the Deputy Minister of Culture's story, sort of like Hajar's family story, is told pretty quickly. It's given with sort of disturbing details and evidence, and it's pretty profound. So why is the Deputy Minister of Culture the target? And why, if he does, is he participating in the killing of Salsa and the rabbit? And I think Hajar's also supposed to be part of that group killed. And what happens to the Deputy Minister, and why? And why do his killers or intended killers want him to die? And I think, Matthew, you're alluding to the fact that you don't think he's ever actually the target. You think Salsa is taking one for the team because of the rabbit egg.
No.
Okay.
I think Salsa is being killed for something he's done in the past.
Okay.
Someone he killed in the past. That's my best guess.
Okay.
And I also don't think Hajar is supposed to die. I think they wait until he goes away from the car to kill Salsa.
Got it.
He's the duckling. He's not done anything yet.
Yeah.
He lives because they want him to live. They don't have any reason to kill him. And he might be useful some other way. However, Salsa has to go. And to get Salsa out of his comfort zone, they plan a very strategic way to kill him.
Yeah.
And, you know, because he's so focused on the mission, he's not thinking as clearly. He even, like, the Deputy Minister of Culture actually sends him, like, a Photoshop picture of the rabbit next to the egg.
Yeah.
As if to say, like, I know what you're doing.
Yeah.
I know all about you. And he wants him to know he knows who he is and what he's doing.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that he's coming to kill him. I think that he's made a deal with Mr. Salman in some respect, and they're killing Salsa. Now, I could be wrong, but I think, you know, that's why they bring a duckling on board. The duckling has no idea what's happening. Hajar. He has no idea what's going on. He can't help Salsa. He kind of goes through the motions of, you know, surveillance after the rabbit egg appears. But eventually they know he's going to walk away from the mission. He's just not, this is not his thing. As I said before, I don't think he wants to kill anybody. I think he wants all the killing to stop. I think that's his character.
Yeah.
And Salsa is a different kind of character. Why I say I don't have a great understanding of him is that I don't really get enough information on him.
Yeah.
But he's been in this life for some time. Otherwise, they wouldn't trust him with a mission where he's number one, where he's the killer, and he already knows who the target is beforehand. And because he knows who the target is beforehand, right, like, he is really noticeably upset when the Deputy Minister of Culture actually sends that picture of the photoshopped rabbit and egg to him. He even tries to call Mr. Salman, who obviously doesn't answer because he knows what's going to happen. I think it's possible that he was one of the soldiers, or possibly the soldier, who raped the Deputy Minister of Culture's wife.
Yeah. Heavy. I'm having one of these moments where I'm largely persuaded by your interpretation of events and rethinking some of the ambiguities. Ingrid, maybe not only can you share a little bit about how you're reading this, but maybe you can lay out some of the end events in a more chronological order for us.
Sure, and I mean, I think maybe I'll touch a little on who the Deputy Minister of Culture was in his story a little bit as well.
Okay.
I mean, I think a question, though, that I want to put to the table, something I'm thinking through. I think my read was actually pretty similar in terms of, I hadn't thought about Hajar in the way that you had, that he was necessarily like meant to be spared. I thought that could be accident as well, but I see your logic there. I think with Salsa, like, my read was similar, that he'd been in the gang, perhaps, especially because this is a story that's told in retrospect, that we get the detail that we do about him and the handler fighting, and that what Hajar has to say about that is that sometimes these killers get sacrificed. I think what is included and what gets left out in this story is very, very careful, so that we get that, I think, pushes me to read that there has been some sort of deal. The language that we get is around the kinds of deals that get made sometimes. So I think, at the very least, that's a possibility that Hajar is thinking about in retrospect.
Well, I will say quickly that they do spend at least 15 minutes at the car after receiving the photoshopped picture of the Rev and the egg.
Yeah.
And if they're, like, they wouldn't, in my mind, they didn't put a timed car bomb on the car, because they wouldn't know when it would go off.
Yeah.
If the mission actually were carried out, Salsa should have already been in the parking garage trying to murder the Deputy Minister of Culture.
Right.
And so I think someone's watching the car.
Yeah.
And triggering the bomb.
Mm.
Yeah.
After Hajar leaves.
And I think, your logic around, like, well, why not tell him about the target ahead of time? Why bring on someone so inexperienced does cohere. I think one thing that trips me up in your interpretation that I'm curious about is, I read Salsal is surprised that the Deputy Minister of Culture is the target, and he uses that language. But we're led to believe that he knows who the target is ahead of time, and that information has been kept from Hajar. So my read is that he was told someone else's name, and that he then finds out that it's the Deputy Minister of Culture, that he didn't have the full story. But I'm curious as to what you guys are thinking around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read this all a little bit differently, so I'm processing
Okay.
a new and, I think, legitimate interpretation. I think Salsal has, we're told, something like 1,000 Facebook friends. I think I manage the 1 Week Critique Facebook, and I get all these weird, like, people will friend us, and it's like, for the most part, they look like they've got all the trappings of, like, just being interested in poetry. And then as soon as I, like, friend them, I realize they've got, like, 4,000 friends, and, like, they only post about poems, but, like, it's, like, arbitrary copy-pastes off of, like, poetry.com, and then pictures of, like, busty but scantily clad women in bikinis underneath. Like, sort of inexplicable stuff like that. I think that, and sometimes those people try and engage me on stuff, and I just have this kind of high paranoia about, like, Russian hackers trying to, like, engage me with nonsense about whatever, right? I think on some level I kept trying to interpret Sal's. I think I also sat there and said, why the hell do two guys who are on a mission and need to be cut off and just do a job and then get out of there need the internet. What's the virtue of that? Isn't that a security risk? And so I kept thinking that somehow this had to be connected to the mission. And so I latched on to the possibility that Salsa is engaging in some kind of portion of psychodrama or management of the task that Hajar is unfamiliar with. And so I think I'm more in line with the possibility, or I was more in line with the possibility of like Salsa being killed by the Deputy Minister of Culture. I think I didn't entirely connect that with Mr. Salman selling him out, or think as hard as you did, Matthew, on the fact that it actually is a very long time for them to be in the car after they realize the mission is compromised. And so I think there are pieces of that I was living in the ambiguity of without explaining to myself that actually, when you lay them out, have more coherence than I was giving that ending credit for, or at least have more plausible coherence than I was giving that ending credit for. And I was just trying to live in that discomfort of not knowing why the internet, why Facebook, why communicate with this person and does or doesn't Salsa know who the target is. But I was also taking the rabbit off the table with Salman.
To him, to his surprise, is the narrator describes when he gets that Photoshop text as Salsa's face going pale.
Yeah.
Which to me says that something has changed, that he wasn't prepared for this, unless it's just that the image scares him. But I think I read that as...
Well,
as a shock. Maybe the shock is simply that the target has known that they're after him. Another valid read that, like, you're aware of the target the whole time, but the new information, the information that pales his face, is that the target was the one who put the egg there, in the rabbit's hutch.
Yeah, I think that was more my original read, although there's something... In some ways, we know the mission is compromised, and there's a lot of questions for me about who knows that the mission is compromised, and when did the mission become?
Yeah.
And for whom Salsal over the deputy minister, if the deputy minister was ever actually the target. But maybe, again, let's lay out what happens to the deputy minister a little bit and help
let
inform
me read a little section here from the book. This is really quite near the end. It's the final story we get before they go off to the mission about the Deputy Minister of Culture. He's on Facebook, Salsa is, and he said he was having a discussion with the Deputy Minister of Culture on sectarian violence and its roots. I gathered from Salsa that this minister had been a novelist in Saddam Hussein's time and had written 3 novels about Sufism. One day, he and his wife were at a party at the home of a wealthy architect overlooking the Tigris. His wife was attractive, stunningly so, and cultured like her husband. She had a particular interest in old Islamic manuscripts. The director of security, a relative of the president, was a guest at the party. After the party was over, the security chief gave his surveillance section orders to read our friend's novels. A few days later, they threw him in jail on charges of incitement against the state in the party. The director of security bargained with the novelist's wife in exchange for her husband's freedom. When she rejected his demands, the security chief had one of his men rape the woman in front of her husband. After that, the woman moved to France and disappeared. They released the novelist in the middle of the 90s, and he went off to look for his wife in France but could find no trace of her. When the dictator's regime fell, he went home and was appointed Deputy Minister of Culture. right? So, like, that is the Deputy Minister of Culture's story. He's a novelist.
Right.
Like, that's his main, like, that's what he was before all of this happened. And, you know, so he now, in this story, is the target. And we don't know why he's the target.
Right.
And one of the reasons I guess I kind of went to the reading I went to is that I don't think he's actually the target.
Yeah.
I think Salsa's the target. And this is his way, now that he's in power, of getting back at Salsa, either for the rape of his wife or for something else he did to him. And, you know, I think Salsa is surprised when he receives the text from the Deputy Minister of Culture, because it's from the Deputy Minister of Culture.
Mm-hmm.
And he's surprised because he's been thinking his online conversations and so forth are him, like, getting to know this man and doing research on, like, what this man is like. And so that when he goes to execute him, he knows what the man's thinking. And thus, when he gets this, he's surprised, A, that it's from the Deputy Minister of Culture, but B, it's the fact that it's that stupid rabbit to him, and that stupid egg to him, and stupid me. I missed it. I knew it, and I brought it up to Mr. Salman, and he reassured me, and I let him reassure me.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have. And now I don't know what to do. And, you know, he's trying to sit there in the car and figure out what to do. And he asks Hajar to be patient and wait a while longer because they were both in danger. Right? Quote, he got back in the car, tried to contact Salman. Right? And so he's trying everything to figure out, what do I do? What do I do? We're going to be killed. But he doesn't realize it's just him that's going to be killed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that seems plausible to me. I think I still have, like, questions about what Salsa knows and when, but I think that feels valid. I don't see anything in this story that tells me that couldn't be.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of still sorting through the elements of what I do and don't accept about the end. I think what is true is that because this is Hajar's story, we don't know when Salsal... I think the one thing I'm positive Salsal doesn't know before that text is that he's about to die. That's the one thing I can say 100% for certain.
Hajar doesn't know that either. He wouldn't have brought the rabbit.
Right, and he does bring the rabbit, and notably, he leaves the car, leaving the rabbit inside. So when the car bomb goes off, the rabbit, R.I.P. goes with it. Yeah.
Notably, we don't know whether the egg's in the car.
That's true.
The rabbit's in the car.
Yeah.
We know that. No mention of the egg.
Shit. On that dark note, let me ask one final question about this. So why is Hajar telling this story, or maybe put another way, why is this story the frame for several sort of puzzling and horrifying things that happen in Hajar's life? And who is he telling that story to exactly?
I think this is a good question and one that got me thinking. I'm not sure that I know who he's telling the story to.
Yeah.
I think what I do see in the story is that he's trying to piece things together almost like we are here.
Yeah.
I think it's a story that is driven by trying to understand what's happened to him and why. And sort of how he got to where he got. Why did he survive? Why did he go on this mission in the first place? And, I think this isn't exactly on the page, but I think I see him going through all of that, and to my point that I was making before about that line, I was completely devastated, and how loud that line seemed to me, and how I wasn't sure that it fit. I think tonally this story feels very minimal and very factual, to the point that sometimes it's hard as a reader to know all the questions that aren't being answered, all the information that's being left out. Like, you're attuned to that, and for me, not always. I think to me, it feels like someone who is trying to have that conversation with himself, but is at once mystified and doesn't have all the information, but also is perhaps not ready to thoroughly engage all of this. So there's a distancing, I would say. I guess if pressed in terms of who his audience is, it almost feels like himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically my answer. Maybe not himself, but like young men in situations like this. He's at most 20, probably. Yeah. Like, that's as old as he could possibly be at this point.
Yeah.
He's probably still like 18, 19, is my guess. And I think the story is basically laying out how easy it is if you live in a zone. Like, the green zone is a zone of supposed safety, right?
Yeah.
And clearly it's not. Like, they say it is, and then there's, like, these other zones, the war zone, or, like, enemy territory, or, like, we have all these, like, different names for things, but nowhere is safe. And I think it's showing, like, how easy it is to be sucked into this, because everything that he's learned up to this point has either been from people that are older from him or from what he's read.
Yeah.
Those are his two ways in. And mostly he's read about animals, plants. And that's why he's in the garden with the rabbit and doing the gardening. Like, a clearly unmale, like,
Yeah.
Occupation, especially for someone who's a terrorist. Right? Like, it's clearly not like, here's Terrorist Manual 101. No, fuck no. This is like, I'm a confused young boy, and I have been, I've had so much drilled into my mind about what is and what is not done, and what you do if something is done to you. And my brothers were killed, and my uncle, someone who should be looking out for my best interests, is not. He's saying, yeah, come join this sect, and we'll have you kill some people. Like, that's not what, and I'm just saying, like, in the hierarchy of Iraq, I don't know everything. I really don't, and I don't even know much. But I'm just thinking about the fact that as a young boy there, you're probably looking up to your male relatives and some of the other popular or influential males in the area.
Yeah. And,
like, because of that, whatever they tell you is, going to carry a lot of weight, even in the face of other media or people you don't really know that say things or whatever. But he has been, put in this position his whole life, and, his only refuge has been learning about these little things about animals and plants, and he's trying to make adult decisions in a war-torn area where no one is safe. And this is to show kind of how it happened to him, how he wishes it hadn't happened to him, but it did.
Yeah.
I think crucially one other thing that I'd add is I haven't read any of the other stories in this collection yet. I'm really eager to. I think this story is just remarkable. But some of why I felt permissed to babble on about Easter is the collection's title is the Iraqi Christ. I think we've got the rabbit, we've got the egg, we've got a character who's saved finally from a violent act. Iconography that's engaged with the Christian tradition and also renewal. So I guess I'd be really curious to see how this particular story sits within the collection. So I imagine with a story this good, that the surrounding stories are talking to it and equally wonderful.
Yeah, it's been 8 or 9 years since I have read the entirety of this book, but it stuck with me for 8 or 9 years. I think, one of the blurbs on the front says that Blasim is one of the finest writers in Arabic today. And I'd say that's pretty true. So I hope you all go out and check out this book. I hope you all do your best to avoid war zones and any need to blow anyone up. Thanks for chatting, friends.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.